Welcome to Speaking Concretely, the official podcast of the Cement Association of Canada. I'm Adam Auer, the President and CEO of the Cement Association of Canada and host of Speaking Concretely. In these first few episodes of the podcast, we've been trying to paint a picture of the cement and concrete sector, from manufacturing to sustainability and economic competitiveness to design and construction and the drivers behind the dominant role that concrete plays in the built environment. So following on the heels of last month's episode on concrete and architecture, I'm pleased to round out these conversations today with a major player in the construction industry. On today's episode, we have the pleasure of welcoming Jolene McLaughlin, Vice President of Climate and Sustainability with EllisDon. I'm sure many of our listeners will recognize EllisDon as a leading construction and building services company. They're also an amazing Canadian success story. EllisDon got its start in London, Ontario over 70 years ago, and since then has grown to service just about every market sector in locations around the world. What you might not know is that they are 100% employee owned, which is quite remarkable for a company of their size. Jolene, welcome to Speaking Concretely.
Thanks, Adam. Happy to join you.
I didn't actually appreciate that EllisDon is an employee-owned company until preparing for this podcast. I find that super interesting. How do you think that affects the culture at EllisDon and its approach to projects?
Yeah, I think it has a really positive effect. We're really proud of our employee ownership program. The company was founded, as you mentioned, in London, Ontario by two brothers back in 1951. Until very recently, it was run by a son of one of the other brothers, and the Smith family had been involved in the company for a really long time. We made the transition to start to give employees opportunities to invest in and see the success of the company be their own reward. And so we're really happy at how that helps us build accountability within the company, because it's a really important value for us too. Yeah,
that's super cool. I mean, for us, obviously, the construction industry is a pivotal partner in the sort of life cycle or value chain of the cement and concrete industry, but obviously as a major client of ours, a major user of the material. Can you explain the fundamental role of concrete in your projects, and why do construction companies choose to build with concrete?
Yeah, so I think we all know concrete is a pretty ubiquitous material. It's used in the foundations of all the buildings that we live in and work in, used for roads and bridges and sidewalks and everything across the globe. We know how concrete performs, and it's used because of its durability and water resistance, particularly when we're putting it against soils, which is why you see it so often in foundations and the like. And so it's going to be something that we need to continue to use as we grow as a society. And so it's a really important piece of that foundational building of the society, so to speak.
Yeah, I want to sort of pivot on that issue of performance, because it has all sorts of implications actually for how concrete is used for, the conversation around sustainability, which we'll get into in a little bit, and also about how we innovate in the sector. And, it sort of got me thinking about how concrete is, on the one hand, a very ancient material. It's been used for thousands of years, but it's also one that's undergoing a transformation or a kind of modernization, if you will, to meet the needs of today and the challenges of today, everything from digitization to artificial intelligence and, of course, sustainability and decarbonization. What are some of the innovations in concrete technology that are having an impact on construction from your perspective?
Yeah, as you say, it's thousands of years old and a fairly familiar material. The modern form of what we use today really has been around for hundreds of years at this point. And so we know how concrete's going to respond and what we can expect from it. So it's really important from that performance expectation on any kind of the critical infrastructure that we build so much of across Canada. We know that there also is a need to think about how we're producing that material and making sure that we're doing it so that we can succeed in future generations. And so we're really looking at these changes in concrete mix designs and being really cautious about how we test them to make sure that they're going to perform well while still meeting those sustainability requirements. We're looking at a lot of tested and known products and maybe looking at using them a little bit differently. Supplementary cementitious materials is something we use across the country and have used for years and years. Fly ash and slag are pretty typical, and we're looking at how to use them in more significant quantities, how to make them kind of into tertiary blends with, maybe both of them being used at the same time, as well as Portland cement or Portland limestone cement. But then also looking at different types of admixtures that can potentially promote the strengths a little bit quicker so that we can get away with lower amount of cement in our mixes overall. We're also looking to our partners in the supply side around how they can innovate in their processes. And so there's a couple of companies that are looking at alternative fuels for in the kilns and to provide that heat needed to process the clinker, as well as different kind of programs that support circularity. So it's a pretty holistic picture on how we can change concrete, but we're also very cautious about how we try that, because we don't want to put it into something if we don't know we can trust it for hundreds of years.
Yeah, that's sort of where I was getting at with the opening of the question around performance. Given the primary reasons that you mentioned, and also on our previous episode with architect Sasha Radulovich, you mentioned performance, durability, longevity, water permeability, all that stuff. The performance of the material is top of mind, and so innovation in a way introduces a kind of risk, whether that risk is real or perceived. And so I'm really curious from the perspective of EllisDon, the projects that you've worked on, what's the process of innovation in materials? Like, how do you introduce new concretes or new uses of concrete products, and what are the steps that you have to sort of go through to overcome the risks, or the sort of to get the kind of comfort that you need to start using these materials and processes on big projects?
Yeah, I think to date the focus has really been on how can we evaluate the mixes that we're choosing in a way that also considers the carbon impact in line with the performance and the cost and the scheduling impacts as well. So we've had some success where we create this collaborative working group amongst the structural engineer, our site team professionals, the concrete supplier, and the form workers and placers, to be able to understand, where can we pull certain levers that may change how long it's going to take for the concrete to set, or where could we use more supplementary cementitious materials to add some more advantageous pieces to that side. We've got a couple of hospitals in BC where we've been working on that. One of them in particular, where we set ourselves with a 20% whole building reduction on the emissions of the materials. And right now the concrete mixes are actually trending over a 40% reduction from the initial mix design. So we're really happy with how we kind of progressed that and thought about, what can we do here without impacting schedule or cost on behalf of the client. So that's really exciting. A couple of other new innovative materials that we're seeing in the market are like a clinker-free cement. There's a lot going on with high early, because we're seeing a lot more high strength material needed in some of these really super tall buildings. And so we're thinking about how to manage that and working with our supply partners on those pieces too. But we want to be really cautious in how we test those out. And so we're looking for, landscaping type applications where it's something that would be easy to pull out if we're not happy with how the setting is going or how the material is performing, just to, as step one to test it out. And then eventually looking at what we can do to actually place that kind of material in real buildings.
Yeah, that's a super important process for our industry to understand as well, because we want obviously to be partnering with construction companies and others in the construction value chain to encourage that type of innovation and make sure that the market is ready to adopt, the kinds of solutions that we're putting forward. I mean, you've already talked about some of the sort of things that you're doing in the sustainability sphere, like the use of SEMs and, working with partners on decarbonization of fuel for heat, for example, in cement kilns. And I should say that our action plan to net zero does have a target of achieving about a 40% substitution rate, replacing fossil fuels in the manufacture of cement with lower carbon alternatives. That's a sector-wide commitment of ours. Overall, I think EllisDon has been very open about its commitment to building sustainably and, maybe including and especially decarbonization. I wonder if, aside from the specific strategies around SCMs and those types of things. How has that commitment changed your approach to construction projects, both when it comes to specifying low carbon concrete or other sustainability initiatives, but also in terms of workflow, like how you work with partners on projects?
Yeah, I think there's lots of pieces of that require some change, and that change requires some kind of thought process and management a little bit. So a couple of different things that we're doing, particularly on our design build jobs, we're really trying to convey the importance of those carbon emission targets to our clients and to us, and getting our partners to kind of support those emissions reductions. For a couple of the big hospitals here in Ontario, we've gone through some pretty significant exercises of just understanding, what does the design look like now? What else could we do to reduce it? We find that when we can reduce the amount of material, obviously we're saving costs, so that has some other tangible benefits to it. But if we can consider carbon as another performance metric that we just have to meet, then that helps kind of guide the conversation around something that optimizes for performance, for schedule, for cost, and for carbon as well. We've now rolled out a process for all of our areas on projects where we can ask through the tender process for the environmental product declarations and the information within them to understand the carbon impacts of the mixes as we're choosing them. The intention there is to have options coming from us and from the supplier that is in agreement with how the engineer wants to process things. But it allows us to evaluate, well, if we change this little thing here, what would the cost implications be? What would the carbon implications be? And can we make a holistic decision instead of only focusing on cost as the option? So it's still really early in our process, trying to get that out and trying to get it communicated amongst our estimators who've really been trained that low cost is king. That's what everybody wants to see. But getting them to understand that our clients are quite interested in knowing the information and supporting that decision-making process instead of just focusing only on solely cost.
I want to pick on the cost thing just briefly, because it did also come up in our conversation last time on the architecture side, and who talked a little bit about the value engineering process. And, what are you finding in terms of the cost of sustainability? Because on the one hand, we understand that, current sustainability approaches have maybe incremental costs on materials, but we do anticipate that as we do the big transformative stuff, not just for cement and concrete, but for steel, aluminum, and other materials, carbon capture, utilization, and storage, for example, these are massive investments that are likely to increase the cost of materials going forward. At the same time, we understand that materials generally make up a relatively small part of an overall project. So I'm curious on your perspective on how that's balanced, because, there's obviously kind of a laser focus on every opportunity to reduce costs in a project, but in the quest for sustainability, how is that balanced with the overall impact of those types of decisions on project where ultimately materials may not play a huge role in the final bill, if you know what I mean?
Done a couple of educational exercises internally to say if concrete is coming up as 1 or 2% of the total cost of the project. And so if we had to increase the cost of the concrete supply by, say, 10%, what does that do to the overall budget? Well, really, it's, less than a percentage point. It's a pretty small variable. The reality is the performers are quite tight, and so everybody's struggling to make those things work. So there is some analysis and evaluation that has to happen there. But I think the important part to me is just opening the conversations and getting that information to be able to make the decision points together. It can't be made alone. The engineers can't tell the best way for us to construct a building. We can't tell the supplier how to design their mixes without taking on the risk in the wrong place. And so we want to make sure it stays where it's supposed to be. But if we can all collaborate and work together, we can look at solutions that, don't have much impact on the cost right now. I do think your point about how we look at it in the future is valid, because we've got a long way to go to hit our emissions targets. And so the reality is a lot of things really have to change. But if right now we can start taking the baby steps that are available to us, understanding what the cost and schedule implications are, and start making decisions around that, it makes us more comfortable with getting to the next level of change. which is also going to require a lot more collaboration so that, our suppliers understand that they're still going to have a market to sell to if they make these multi-billion dollars investments into some of the CCS projects that we see down the line.
Yeah, really, really well said. I think the collaboration theme is one that, many of us are coming to understand a lot more in a lot more sort of detail, or with a lot more clarity. Certainly when we were developing the modeling for our Concrete Zero Action Plan, we know that the decarbonization of the built environment and even of the cement and concrete sector itself is what we would call, I guess, a team sport, right? So it's not possible to do it alone. We can't decarbonize cement and concrete without the help of engineers and specifiers and policymakers and developers. The whole, the sort of whole construction value chain has to come together. I wonder if you might kind of explore that just a little bit more, like from your perspective, how important is collaboration between concrete suppliers and construction professionals, and how do you see that collaboration evolving in the last number of years, based on this emerging push for sustainability and innovation?
Yeah, I would say it's quite an interesting space, right? Because traditionally construction projects are done in silos. The owner, hires on some consultants. They work together on a design, then they send it out to the market and hope that the market will bid and build on it. And not really allowing for give and take or thought process into how things could be done just a little bit differently to change outcomes. We're seeing a lot more requests for pre-construction engagement and long reconstruction engagement so that we can help identify, from a constructability perspective, is there a better way to go about this kind of detailing, or, what would the sequencing look like that would actually provide more advantage to the schedule? And so that changing landscape of collaboration is quite important. And even on the design side, us getting involved and providing input and feedback on, we've seen these type of mixes perform in this way. EllisDon has a really deep R&D team with a lot of specialization in concrete in particular as well. And so there's two females that kind of run the concrete side of it. They have had, tons of life experience and career experience on how concrete performs, what they can expect it to do, and just managing the heat of hydration through reducing amount of cement. All of those pieces need to be done and need to be thought about holistically so that the engineers are comfortable with what they're specifying and that it meets actually the designs they intended. And we're comfortable with, what we're producing and what we're providing to the client is actually going to achieve the outcomes that we were paid to make sure happen.
What about collaboration, like within your subsector, or within, across construction companies? Like, I know one of the biggest challenges for us, when we developed our roadmap was, we wanted it to be representative of the sector of the whole. So we work very hard as an industry to come together, cement, all the, ready mix producers, precast, masonry, block, the whole value chain, to come to a consensus on what we thought was possible in our sector. And that's, a time consuming process, but it's been, I think, invaluable to the progress that we're making as an industry. Is that playing out as well among construction companies? Like, you find that there's now a community of peers that are trying to share lessons learned and push for some of the same kind of changes that we all need to get some of these solutions into the market?
Yeah, I think we are seeing a marked change on that now. Construction is traditionally a pretty competitive space. And so it was hard going to make sure that, we are actually working together to achieve certain outcomes. But I would say, through the COVID pandemic and with the surge of the importance of health and safety, we've seen that collaboration can take us a lot further. And we identify sustainability as another area that's going to happen. My CEO has said, we can't compete on sustainability. We all have to get to the same outcomes, and we're going to do that together. And so there's actually just recently been a group of the leading 9 GCs that have kind of formed as the sustainability leads to say, okay, we're going to work together. We're going to figure out what this decarbonization means for us. And we're going to look through different pieces of the industry and kind of work together to get as far as we can with it, identifying that we're still competitors in some ways and we still need to compete, but what can we do to help move things further along rather than trying to outdo each other on saving the planet, which is never going to work anyways.
Yeah, fantastic to hear that some of that collaboration is starting. Of course, whatever we can do to help, we're very keen to collaborate, as you know. One of the areas that I think would be super helpful for us to kind of come together on, not just construction companies and manufacturers, but others, engineers and specifiers as well, is codes and standards. So you may know from our roadmap to decarbonize cement, in particular, the work that we've done with the Government of Canada. We've had a lot of conversations with the National Research Council, Standards Council of Canada, Commission on Building and Fire Codes, about the role that codes and standards can play, and of course how those codes and standards are translated into specifications. The role that they play in either enabling or preventing innovation. Not just in low carbon, but innovation in general in construction. How do you see, those changing regulations or building codes impacting the use of concrete in your construction projects?
Yeah, I think the reality is the codes and standards are there to keep us safe. We don't want underperforming buildings. We can't afford to do that. But we also have seen a really significant change in how sustainability has really been pushed forward. I would say since 2018, it's been like exponential. Codes and standards have just not had the capacity to keep up with that rate of change, and we're almost daily seeing kind of new materials and innovations and options that can come forward, but without changes in the codes and standards, we never get the opportunity to test out those innovations. So we've got to find a way to make sure that we're not just relying on how we've always done things as the only way we can keep doing things without, taking risks that aren't acceptable from a loss of life or a loss of asset kind of perspective. So to me, trying to find ways to make the codes and standards more performance-based, to say, okay, this product has to last for X number of years. It can't let water through. It can't do all of these other things. And then including carbon as a carbon emissions impact as a performance factor that needs to be considered, it allows us some more latitude and some more flexibility to try different things that will work. I think there's also something to be said for a really rigorous kind of testing program. And so we know that, major concrete suppliers also have their pretty rigorous testing programs. We're trying to figure out how we do that at a building level and a building scale to make sure that, we're also really comfortable with what we're placing for our clients is actually going to meet the requirements that it needs to. So there's another element of collaboration, I think, between how the codes and standards are written and how they're put into practice that we need to focus on too.
And yeah, the putting into practice piece is always fascinates me, because even with today's codes and standards, we often see specifications that are sometimes even more restrictive. You might have, for example, Portland limestone cement, which we introduced through the codes and standards, and almost a decade ago now. It was quite a long process to even get it through the codes and standards, but there's still a hesitation to translate the acceptance in standards into specifications. And, I think that's also where construction companies can really play a huge role, is by driving the specification side of the equation. I'm not sure if you see that a lot as well, where the codes and standards will allow a certain type of innovation, but there's still a hesitancy by the specifiers to use it.
Yeah, I think we know that, engineers are by nature a conservative bunch, and we, in a lot of ways, need them to be. But yeah, if we can find ways to trust and verify some of these new options, like I said, we don't want to put something that we don't know is going to last and perform the way we need it to into a building. But we need to also figure out how we shift and change what we're actually doing to make sure that we're more responsible for the long term, and we can create a planet we can keep. So there's some balance there for sure. I think on the vertical infrastructure side, we see a lot of collaboration with the engineers, and there's maybe a bit more latitude to try, or not to try, but to refine how the mixes are done and how we use the concrete within the buildings. On the linear infrastructure side, there seems to be less allowances for, different kinds of options. And I think justifiably so. It's quite a significant undertaking to build a bridge or any other type of linear infrastructure. But can we look at how we would test something and find new ways to test something to have comfort it's going to last for 100 years without waiting for the 100 years that we don't have to test it out?
Yeah, it's very consistent with our experience too. It's often the horizontal infrastructure where there's the most resistance to change and innovation, and as you say, for a variety of important reasons. Well, we've covered quite a bit of ground in 25 minutes, but I thought maybe I'd just offer you an opportunity as a parting thought, to share your advice for developers and builders on how to better understand and leverage the capabilities of concrete, including some of these, its role in meeting decarbonization and other challenges with respect to your projects and meeting other project goals.
Yeah, I think the more that developers and clients of all types can be really clear that they're interested in finding ways to reduce emissions and would be willing to consider a cost change for that, that's really helpful. The project teams are very focused on low cost and meeting schedule because that's the long-term drivers have always been there. But we are looking for opportunities to kind of test those boundaries and see what can be done. What else can we do at the low cost and no schedule impact kind of level? But without the clients, being accepting of those opportunities, we don't get the chance to try it and learn more too. So the more you can communicate clearly to your internal partners and our partners as well, the more we can kind of work together towards these goals. And you make sure you're aligning with partners that want to collaborate and want to work on this. Like I said, the engineering community can be pretty resistant to change, but not unjustifiably so. And so how do we make sure we're looking at those that are looking from both sides of it to say what can they do from a more sustainable perspective, but what can they also, while making sure that they're not underscoring any of their required obligations as well.
Jolene, thank you so much for being a guest on today's podcast. I really enjoyed this discussion, exploring the connection between the construction industry and the world of cement and concrete, if you will. I hope this episode was engaging for our audience as well. As always, if you have any topics you'd like us to explore in future episodes, we'd love to hear from you. Thank you so much for tuning in, and don't forget to subscribe and follow us on your favorite podcast platform. I look forward to catching you all again on our next episode.